Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, shrewd politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. As a ruler of France and its empire for nearly 15 years, Napoleon was also a reformer and improver. He played a leading role in solidifying the gains and ideals of the French Revolution, promoting equality and careers open to talent, securing religious freedom and tolerance, ending aristocratic and feudal privilege, and founding the Civil Code, a unified and progressive code of laws which are still in use across Europe to this day. Napoleon's empire helped provide the basis for what is today the European Union. For this reason, Napoleon is often considered the father of modern Europe, and ever since him, the world was never really the same. To this day, Napoleon remains one of the most written about men in history, second only to Jesus Christ. Inspiring masterpieces of music, art, literature and poetry, from Beethoven's stirring Third Symphony to Tolstoy's War and Peace. Few fictional characters have ever done as much as Napoleon Bonaparte. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon is still something of an enigma, both a hopeless romantic idealist and the bitterest of cynics. The combination of his irresistible charm when he chose to deploy it, his iron will, workaholic habits, inspirational speeches and sayings, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit afire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. The rise of an obscure Corsican boy to the very pinnacle of fame and fortune, from soldier to statesman to emperor, has spellbound generation after generation. The French Revolution had just begun, and Napoleon wholeheartedly supported it. Over the next 4 years, Napoleon would be far more concerned with Corsican politics and bringing the ideals of the French Revolution to the island than his career as a French officer. Now in his early 20s, Napoleon was to face constant disappointments. Over the next few years, everything was to go disastrously wrong. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, Napoleon could very well have just nodded silent approval to the new laws and left it at that. As a second lieutenant, he had his daily military duties to perform. But in his writings, he had stated his obligation to become involved, to act on behalf of his fellow man. As he wrote to one friend at the time, "The blood of the South flows through my veins with the swiftness of the Rhone." Napoleon first threw himself into Corsican politics. In Ajaccio, Napoleon began seeing to the distribution of the French tricolour cockade, and also arranged for all the soldiers who were still wearing the white royalist cockade to swap them in. "We are patriots," he told them. He also helped to set up the sort of patriotic clubs that were forming all over France, and tried to organise a regiment, like the French National Guard, of Corsican volunteers. In October, he wrote a pamphlet denouncing the French commander in Corsica and criticising the island's government as insufficiently revolutionary. In a letter to his old childhood hero, Paoli, Napoleon wrote, In an instant, everything has changed. From the depths of this nation, an electric spark had exploded. Man, man, how despicable you are in slavery! How great when the love of freedom inflames you! But Napoleon did not act alone. The Buonapartes were represented by three politically talented brothers, Joseph, Napoleon, and later Lucien. With Napoleon occasionally stuck back on France with his regiment, his older brother Joseph became the family's political frontman on the island, and was even elected Ajaccio's mayor. The family was among the first to take advantage of the revolution's nationalisation of church lands to purchase some excellent plots at outrageously low insider prices. Meanwhile, in France, the revolution was intensifying. Women from the marketplace of Paris rioted over the high price of bread, marched on the king's palace of Versailles. The next day, they forced the king, his family, and most of the French assembly to return with them to Paris, effectively ending the king's independence. In November 1789, the National Assembly proclaimed the island of Corsica a department of the French Republic, subject to the same constitution as the rest of France. In theory, Corsica was now as French as Burgundy. Napoleon supported the move, while Paoli denounced it from London as a measure designed to impose the will of Paris. Seizing the moment, Paoli, Corsica's previous enlightened ruler, before he was defeated and ousted by the conquering French decades before, suddenly left England, where he had been in exile for 22 years. After a triumphant tour of Paris, where he swore an oath of allegiance to the new French constitution, Paoli returned to Corsica in July 1790, and on landing on the shore dropped to his knees and kissed the earth. In those early days, Paoli seemed pleased with events and prepared to march hand in hand with revolutionary France towards rebuilding a more justly administered, democratic Corsica. Paoli was immediately appointed Lieutenant of Corsica and President of the Corsican General Council. Although Paoli's prestige on the island remained unique, he enjoyed nothing like the power he had had 30 years before, when he had ruled Corsica with an iron fist in a velvet glove. Paoli was now subject to the revolution and to its strongest local advocates, men like Salicetti, the French government's representative on the island, who was strongly supported by the Buonapartes. In return, Salicetti acted as the family's patron and protector. As the sons of Carlo Bonaparte, Paoli's old friend and comrade, Napoleon and Joseph had been among Paoli's welcoming committee, where Paoli even gave Joseph a thoughtful souvenir, a playing card that had once served him and Carlo as secret identification. There was much that Napoleon shared with Paoli, beginning with their temperaments and love of Corsica, not to mention their sharing of Paoli's self-esteem for Paoli. However, 20-year-old Napoleon, no matter how great his love for Corsica, had by now become an uncompromising devotee of the revolution. As Napoleon told Paoli, "Henceforward we have the same interests, the same concerns. There is no longer a sea separating us." Napoleon had the French perspective. As a result, Paoli largely saw the Buonaparte boys as the children of a collaborator, and made minimal effort to ensure their loyalty, despite Napoleon's patent eagerness for his approval. According to legend, Paoli was infuriated with Napoleon's criticism of his troop dispositions when they toured the battlefield of Ponte Nuovo together, the site of Paoli's defeat at the hands of the French. Nevertheless, Paoli also said to Napoleon on this occasion, "O Napoleone, there is nothing modern in you. You belong only to the heroes of Plutarch." The next month, the National Assembly passed a motion proposed by Mirabeau that although Corsica was now a part of France and subject to its laws, she would from now on be governed solely by Corsicans. Huge celebrations greeted the news across the islands. Church bells were rang, and Napoleon hung a huge banner from the Buonaparte house which read, "Vive la nation, vive Paoli, vive Mirabeau." In 1791, France was presented with her very first constitution, thought up by Mirabeau. It abolished the feudal system and limited the power of the king, who now came under the supervision of the government, making France a constitutional monarchy, as well as guaranteeing the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and also equality before the law. Before then, Napoleon recalled, "If I had received the order to turn my cannons against the people, I do not doubt the habit, prejudice, education, the name of the king, all would have made me obey it. Now I knew only the nation. My natural inclinations from then on were in harmony with my duties." But the French Revolution and its new constitution were under attack from the nobles and clergy and from all the monarchies of Europe. Napoleon decided to act in its defence. Napoleon played a leading part in a ceremony condemning the king and the royal family's attempted flight to Belgium, presumably to rally their fellow foreign monarchs to reinstate them to full power. The royal family was practically dragged back to Paris. 3 days later, Napoleon swore the oath demanded of all officers to die rather than to allow a foreign power to invade French soil. On the 14th of July, he swore an oath of loyalty to the new constitution and at a banquet proposed a toast to the patriots of Exile. Now, property began to be confiscated from the clergy and nobility and put up for sale by the government. At first, people were frightened to buy, fearing a counter-revolution. Finally, a man plucked up the courage, put down his money and made a purchase. Napoleon again stepped forward, publicly congratulating the man for his patriotism. Once again, Napoleon was desperate to return to Corsica. When he arrived back in Ajaccio, his mother Letizia greeted him with tears in her eyes, telling him, "Your father would be so proud of you." Still young and attractive, Letizia had already declined 2 offers of marriage, wishing to remain faithful to the memory of her husband and fully devote herself to her children. Even 7 years after Carlo's death, she still wore black in mourning. As Napoleon recalled, "Left without guide, without support, my mother was obliged to take the direction of affairs upon herself, but the task was not above her strength. She managed everything, provided for everything, with a prudence which could neither have been expected from her sex nor from her age. Ah, what a woman! Where shall we look for her equal? Losses, privation, fatigue had no effect upon her. She endured all, braved all. She had the energy of a man, combined with the gentleness and delicacy of a woman." Instead of 3 servants to help her with housework, Letizia could only afford 1 now, who out of loyalty insisted on staying, even though they could only afford to pay her just 3 francs a month. Letizia had so much housework to do that for a time she could no longer fulfill her self-imposed vow of attending daily mass. She even had to borrow money, a loathsome resort for any Corsican. She accepted 600 francs from the French lieutenant general commanding in Corsica, and sometime later offered to sell her silver in order to pay him back. The officer gallantly refused. Also in the Buonaparte household was Archdeacon Luciano, now 76, and confined to his bed by gout, from where he continued to run a highly profitable business in farms, wine, horses, wheat and pigs. He was also fond of lawsuits. In 1 year, he had appeared in court on 5 separate occasions. Usually he won his cases and had become very rich. For safety, he kept all of his money in gold coins, hidden under his mattress. But despite his family's financial difficulties, Luciano would barely part with a penny. Napoleon remembered, "He strove hard to persuade us that he had saved nothing. If I asked him for money, 'You know well,' he said, 'that I have it not. Your father's extravagance has left me with nothing.'" When money was badly needed, Pauline, the most charming of Napoleon's sisters, only 11 at the time, was delegated to go up to the old man's room and try, while playing around, to extract a gold louis or 2 out of his mattress. One day, the whole bag fell with a clatter on the tiled floor. Speechless for a moment, the Archdeacon soon roused the house with his cries. Letizia ran upstairs and found him staring, outraged at his treasure hoard scattered all over the room. The brothers burst out into fits of laughter. He swore by all the saints in heaven that none of the gold was his. He was only keeping it for friends or clients. Letizia silently picked up the coins. The Archdeacon counted them, put them back in the bag, and replaced the bag in his mattress. Archdeacon Luciano's health grew steadily worse, and it was plain the end was in sight. His family gathered around the old man's bed with a crucifix hanging above the bedstead. Napoleon's uncle, Feschk, began to recite the usual sermons, but the dying man interrupted him. "No, give over," he cried out. "I have but a few moments to live, and I wish to devote them to my family." Laid on his mattress filled with gold, Archdeacon Luciano said his last words. "You, Joseph, are the eldest of the family, but you, Napoleon, are the head of it. Take care to remember my words." Despite the vast precedence the eldest son usually takes in a Corsican family, the Archdeacon's last words signifies that he recognised in Napoleon those virtues which, to a Corsican, consisted of full manhood, energy, courage and independence. To Napoleon's more easygoing older brother, Joseph, this was a disinheritance. With the Archdeacon's death, his property passed over to Letizia's sons. Overnight, the Buonapartes found themselves no longer poor, but quite well off. This was a stroke of luck for Napoleon and his brothers, who were keen to play a part in Corsican politics, a rough world where one did not get far without the influence of wealth. Corsica was sharply divided between those who welcomed the new French constitution of 1791 and those who opposed these new measures, particularly those against the church. Napoleon belonged firmly to the first group, and furthermore, he believed that only a strong National Guard, or citizens' army of volunteers, could implement the constitution and bring its benefits to the Corsican people. In time, he and his brothers would quickly become the foremost friends of France. Hoping that it would pay out in the form of success for Corsica, Napoleon became increasingly more a soldier of the revolution. So Napoleon campaigned for the National Guard. He ran for a place as Lieutenant Colonel in the Corsican 2nd Battalion. It not only paid better, but it had the bonus of Napoleon being stationed as near to his family as possible. In the election, there was lots of bribery involved, as usual in Corsica, and one of the 3 election observers was even kidnapped on the day of the polls and detained in the Casa Buonaparte until the election was safely won. Napoleon's chief opponent, the influential politician Charles Pozzo di Borgia's brother Matteo, was shouted down from the campaign podium outside the church by Napoleon's armed supporters. Corsican politics was always tough, but Paoli, who supported Matteo, thought these tactics too much and demanded an official inquiry into what he called corruption and intrigue. But in a sign of things to come, he was blocked from doing so by the Buonaparte's ally, Salicetti, who represented the government of France on the island, and so the result stood. 22-year-old Napoleon became Lieutenant Colonel, second in command, in the Corsican National Guard Volunteer Battalion, a privilege for one so young. With Napoleon at their head, these Corsican volunteers supported the French Revolution and lived in hope of seeing those ideas triumph in Corsica. But soon after his appointment as Lieutenant Colonel, Napoleon found himself faced with a tricky situation. Paris had decreed the suppression of all the ancient monasteries and convents in Corsica, with the proceeds going to the central government's coffers. Naturally, there were protests from Paoli and the vast majority of Corsicans. Napoleon himself supported the decree in a pamphlet that was inflammatory enough that he and Joseph only narrowly escaped a lynching in Ajaccio when passing by a religious procession. They were only saved by the chance passing of a bandit who came to their rescue. A week after Napoleon's election, on Easter Sunday 1792, a group of priests who refused to swear loyalty to the new constitution entered Ajaccio's closed-down friary and celebrated Mass. A dispute arose, which soon became a battle between the opposers and supporters of the new French constitution, between the old order and the new. Napoleon decided that the priests were being disloyal to the French government and alerted his guards, ordering them to restore peace. When Napoleon arrived at the scene, near the cathedral, one of the priest's supporters suddenly pulled out a gun, and one of Napoleon's officers fell dead at his side. Stilettos flashed, pistols blazed. Napoleon carried his comrade's body back to headquarters, and in the name of the new constitution, decided to fight it out with the riotous friar supporters. The key to Ajaccio was its citadel, a powerful fortress with sheer walls and big guns. But its French commander, Colonel Maillard, refused to help Napoleon and used the revolt as an opportunity to undermine him, sending French troops to clear the streets of Napoleon's National Guard. Napoleon refused to be cleared, and at times in the narrow streets, the troops of the French garrison and Napoleon's armed Corsican volunteers were blazing away at each other. Napoleon went to see Maillard to try to defuse the situation. His men were exhausted after fighting the friar's supporters, and he asked if they might sleep in the citadel. Maillard refused. "Then at least give us some ammunition," Napoleon said. "We are running short." Again, Maillard said no. Napoleon considered these replies an act of defiance against the Corsican people's army, and thus the Corsican people's rights. The French-held citadel seemed like just another form of repression, a Bastille. Abruptly leaving Maillard, Napoleon went round Ajaccio, calling for volunteers to storm the citadel, but no one would listen. They were concerned with the friary, not the fortress. Finally, Napoleon led his guards, short of ammunition and exhausted by a day and 2 nights fighting, against the citadel alone, and the attack failed. When the Ajaccians eventually calmed down, 34 of them were put in prison. Napoleon's battalion was sent away to Corte, 3 days' march away. This was a blow to Napoleon. It left Ajaccio in the hands of Colonel Maillard. It isolated him from his family, his friends, and his chosen political arena. It also seemed to condone the Ajaccians' resistance to the new constitution. Worse still, Maillard sent an angry report to the Minister of War, accusing Napoleon, a French officer, of taking arms against a French garrison. Napoleon, he said, should be court-martialed. Paoli took Maillard's side. ordering Napoleon to leave Ajaccio and report to him at Corte, where he and Joseph were coldly received. Afterwards, Joseph told his brother with considerable alarm, "It seems urgent that you go to France," and Napoleon thought so too. At all costs, he must clear himself of Maillard's charges. Napoleon said goodbye to his family and caught the first boat back to France. Napoleon, with his zeal for the French Revolution, had seriously misjudged the entire situation in Ajaccio. What is worse, due both to Maillard's complaints and the extra leave he had taken without permission, Napoleon could not return to his old garrison in Valence either. He had lost his place in the French army. Napoleon arrived in Paris to try to regain his position, but in the chaotic state of public affairs, little attention was given to such cases, and Napoleon was forced to wait. Fortunately for him, Maillard's report of the messy affair was buried under a mountain of far more pressing War Ministry paperwork. Indeed, Paris was on the brink of anarchy. Severe food riots that winter had sharpened France's political crisis. The new revolutionary government would go through 6 war ministers between May and October 1792. Almost all Napoleon's old comrades from the École Militaire had fled France and emigrated. Then in early February, an alliance was announced between Austria and Prussia, whose unavowed but hardly secret intention was to topple the French revolutionary government and restore the monarchy. France had preemptively declared war on both of them and invaded the Austrian Netherlands, present-day Belgium, to forestall an expected invasion of France. Although Britain was not yet part of the war, her hostility to the revolution was also clear. The French Revolution had entered a new phase. It had become an international conflict, the kings and aristocracy of Europe versus the people of France. The deeper the Austrian and Prussian invaders advanced, the more nervous and edgy the Parisians became. They suspected Louis XVI of conniving with his fellow kings. They suspected their Austrian-born queen, Marie Antoinette. Their fears might have been quelled by Mirabeau, but he had died the year before, and now there was no one to calm the frightened, angry crowds who marched and protested and looted. Napoleon wrote to his brother, "Paris is in a state of grave agitation. The number of National Guards on duty to protect the King at the Tuileries have been doubled. There is a vast amount of desertion among army officers. From every point of view, the situation is most critical." Napoleon again wrote to Joseph, "The country is distracted by fanatical parties. It is difficult to seize the thread of such complex events. How it will all turn out is more than I can guess, but the aspect of things is very revolutionary." Napoleon spent his days visiting the War Office, listening to the debates in the Assembly, looking up old friends and studying the mood of the people. Disgraced and practically destitute, he was forced to pawn his watch. Napoleon's boots were now falling to pieces, and he hired a cheap bootmaker who was not a very good workman, but who accommodated him in his overdue payments. And even when elevated first consul of France and then emperor, he continued to employ him. Napoleon and his old school friend Bourrienne, who had forsaken the army for a career in law, roamed the streets of Paris in revolution, sat disconsolate in dingy restaurants dining on nauseating food, and despite only having a few francs between them, talked of making a fortune by buying up some unfinished houses and subletting them. While Napoleon waited in Paris, he witnessed the infamous days of the Second Revolution. On the 20th of June, Napoleon and Bourrienne were lunching at a restaurant near the Palais Royal. Suddenly, a mob of 5,000 ragged men arrived on the scene. They were armed with pikes, axes, swords, muskets, and pointed sticks. Some wore red bonnets, and were therefore extreme left Jacobins, virulently anti-monarchy. They were shouting abuse and heading towards the palace of the imprisoned king. "Let's follow this rabble," said Napoleon, turning to Bourrienne. The 2 young men ran ahead of the mob. Climbing an iron fence, they stood on a riverside terrace and watched the mob as they reached the assembly building and demanded entrance. For an hour the horde, singing revolutionary songs and waving a plank of wood to which was nailed a bloody ox heart with the inscription "The Heart of Louis XVI," filed through the hall. Then they broke into the Tuileries gardens and palace, chanting coarse slogans, and clambered up the wide 17th century staircase to the royal apartments. It looked like bloodshed would occur, but the king received them graciously, gave his consent to let them stick a red revolutionary bonnet upon his head, and even drank a glass of wine with them, toasting to the health of the revolution. For 2 hours, the king stayed with his riotous visitors, while they shouted and demonstrated. Then, reassured, they eventually drifted away. The triumph of drunken vagrants over all law and justice, and the spectacle of the degradation of one of the mightiest monarchs on the globe, horrified Napoleon. According to Bourrienne, he turned away from the sight, calling it unendurable, and exclaimed in disgust, "The wretches! How could they allow that rabble to enter the palace? They ought to have swept down 500 of them with grape shot, and the rest would have taken themselves off very quickly." The king came out of it well, Napoleon wrote to Joseph, but an incident like this is unconstitutional and a very dangerous example. Napoleon could not understand how the king had meekly allowed himself to be humiliated. As he later recalled, "When I was told that Louis had put a red cap on his head, I concluded that his reign was over, for in politics, an act that degrades can never be lived down." Coming events increasingly convinced Napoleon that France was not yet ready for self-government solely by the people, and that they needed the guidance and control of law, with civil privileges cautiously and gradually distributed among them. He openly avowed that France without greater education and morals was not prepared for the republicanism of the United States. Austria and Prussia invaded France 10 days later, inviting the well-justified supposition that the king and his Austrian wife sympathised with the invasion and were collaborating with France's enemies, who now publicly stated their wish to restore them to full authority. Daily scenes of brutality were now enacted before Napoleon's eyes in the streets of Paris. The situation climaxed on the notorious 10th of August, when swarming crowds roamed the streets. It was a blazing hot day and tempers were frayed. Learning that there were disturbances at the Tuileries, Napoleon, who then shared a cramped attic hotel room on the Rue de Mai with Bourrienne, hurried to a house in the Place de Carrousel, where Bourrienne's brother owned a pawn shop, with Napoleon's watch among the items. Before reaching the Carrousel, Napoleon recalled, "I had been met in the Rue de Coutuchon by a group of hideous men bearing a head at the end of a pike. Seeing that I was presentably dressed and had the appearance of a gentleman, they approached me and asked me to shout, 'Vive la République,' which, as you can easily imagine, I did without difficulty." From the shop window, Napoleon had a view of the Tuileries and of the crowd beginning to form in front of it, no longer just Parisians, but National Guardsmen fresh from the provinces. They were chanting La Marseillaise. This anthem, perhaps the most stirring ever written, made provincials and Parisians alike feel a common cause and a new strength. King Louis XVI appeared outside the palace. The crowd booed and shouted insults. Louis retreated back inside again. He wanted to remain there, but he was begged by advisers to take refuge with the Queen and their children in the Assembly building. Driven from the hall of their ancestors, the royal family was followed by the frenzied mob, hooting and hissing insults, and were in momentary peril of assassination. Then the furious National Guardsmen broke into the palace forecourt, and the firing started. No one knew who fired the first shot. The Swiss Guard, as protectors of the king, resisted, but the crowd brought out cannon and started shelling the palace. Hoping to avert bloodshed, the king sent orders for his Swiss Guard to stop fighting. "Ciccoglione! What asses!" Napoleon exclaimed, as he saw the Swiss Guards refrain from firing on the mob, at what turned out to be to the cost of their lives. The National Guardsmen swarmed into the palace almost unopposed, broke down the doors with axes, and killed whoever they found, mainly courtiers and Swiss Guards, who were shot down in the garden, pursued and daggered in the streets, and bayoneted on the statues on which some had climbed for safety. France had been ruled by kings for nearly 1,000 years. That day, the French Bourbon monarchy had fallen. At noon, Napoleon arrived at the Tuileries just as the violence had ended and crossed to the palace forecourt, now a great pool of blood, where 800 men lay dead or dying. What he saw turned his stomach. The sight of the dead Swiss Guards, he recalled, gave me an idea of the meaning of death such as I had never had since, on any of the battlefields. Perhaps it was the smallness of the area which made the number of corpses appear larger, or perhaps it was because this was the first time I had undergone such an experience. Napoleon also saw men from Marseille killing in cold blood. As one of them pointed his musket at a wounded Swiss guard, Napoleon intervened, at the risk of his own life. "You're from the south?" he asked the soldier. "So am I. Let's save this poor soul." The soldier, either from shame or pity, dropped his musket, and on that day of bloodshed, at least one life was saved. Napoleon was especially sickened to see well-dressed, respectable-looking women committing acts of the grossest indecency on the corpses, stripping the bodies of clothes and valuables, while the most savage of them mutilated the bodies. While the crowd drifted away, laden with Marie Antoinette's jewels, silver and dresses, Napoleon went to the nearby cafes, scanning people's faces. He saw there only anger and hatred. What had become of the great ideals, the sense of law, justice and fraternity, which had launched the revolution? Like many supporters of the revolution, this infamous massacre wrought quite a revolution in Napoleon's mind. He, like many French people, despised how tyrannical and debased the monarchy had become, and had himself suffered at the hands of the superciliousness of the old nobility. Napoleon had his own path to make in the world, and had been glad to see all these bulwarks battered down. On the other hand, the rabid dominion of the mob appeared to him so reprehensible that he said at this time, "I frankly declare that if I were compelled to choose between the old monarchy and Jacobin misrule, I should infinitely prefer the former." The excesses of the Jacobins that he witnessed strengthened his already strong distaste for mob action and violence. The opposing forces of monarchy and Jacobinism would guide Napoleon's future career, and from then on he showed an unconcealable distaste for the Jacobin radicals. One Parisienne asked him at this time, "How do you like the new constitution?" "Why, it is good in one sense, to be sure, but all that is connected with carnage is bad." "No, no, away with this new constitution, I do not like it. Our leaders are poor examples of men, I have to say." Napoleon, still a believer in constitutional monarchy, felt that leadership should have come from the king. If Louis XVI had shown himself on horseback, victory would have been his. That hot August day, Napoleon learned a lesson he was never to forget, that once leadership breaks down, even the most generous ideals go awry. Writing to his brother Joseph, Napoleon vented, "Seeing the whole business close to, when you get right down to it, the crowd is hardly worth the great effort one takes to curry its favour." The mass of Parisians are essentially the same as the Corsicans, or anyone else for that matter, in their pettiness, wickedness, and their disposition to slander and tear down. Each one pursues his individual interest and tries to excel in horrors. Intrigues are today as base as they ever were. It is enough to destroy all ambition. Speaking of which, Napoleon had been going regularly to the War Office. He somehow managed to explain his conduct in Ajaccio so satisfactorily that the idea of a court-martial was dropped. His keenness to bring the benefits of the revolution to Corsica had made a very favourable impression. Not only was he allowed to return to his command, but that July Napoleon was promoted to captain. His cheeky request that he be promoted to lieutenant colonel in the regular army, on the grounds that he had been one in the Corsican National Guard, was marked without response. From the last day of August, Napoleon would be known as Captain Buonaparte. "I would never again be the same man," Napoleon later said. But success was soon followed by a fresh worry. His little sister, 15-year-old Marianne, had been attending the aristocratic convent girls' school at Saint-Cyr, but now this school had just been shut down, and the pupils were forced to leave. Concerned for his sister's safety, Napoleon hurried to fetch her and bring her with him back to Corsica. He had not seen her for 8 years. Often described as the most plain, even masculine, of Napoleon's sisters, she was also the most intelligent, although her conversation style was stilted due to her stiff aristocratic education. Napoleon was forced to return to the dangers of Paris with his sister in order to book 2 places in a stagecoach headed for Marseille, a week in advance. While waiting around in Paris, perhaps to celebrate his new captaincy, Napoleon took his sister to the opera. At Saint-Cyr, Marie-Anne had been taught that the opera was indecent and the work of the devil. In the theatre, Napoleon noticed that she was initially obedient to her teacher's instructions and sat there with her eyes shut tight. Before long, however, she was unable to resist the lure of the music and sat in rapt attention. Napoleon and Marie-Anne were still in Paris when the September massacres began, in which, in a bid to save the country, the terrified and fanatical Parisians tried to put rivers of blood between themselves and the aristocratic émigrés. Verdun had fallen to the Duke of Brunswick's invading Prussian army, after which 4 days of wanton killing of suspected collaborators began. More than 1,200 people, including 115 priests, were murdered by the mob in the city's prisons in cold blood. 2 days afterwards, Napoleon and Marie-Anne boarded the stagecoach to Marseille. Napoleon doubtless observed his sister's aristocratic school uniform with considerable unease. Embroidered with the fleur-de-lis and the emblem of Saint Louis, it was enough to get her strung up on a street lamp. All the way across France, the girl with the Saint-Cyr accent, manners and appearance made a bad impression on the Jacobin crowds. And when she climbed down from the coach in Marseille, a threatening mob pointed to her feathered taffeta bonnet. "Aristocrats! Death to the aristocrats!" they shouted. "We're no more aristocrats than you are," Napoleon retorted, and quickly snatching the bonnet from her head, threw it into the crowd, who cheered. Napoleon found Corsica far more anti-French than it had been when he had left, especially after the September massacres and the declaration of the Republic. Yet he remained, as he put it, persuaded that the best thing Corsica could do was to become a province of France. He moved from being a Corsican nationalist to a French revolutionary simply because the politics of France and of Corsica had profoundly changed, and so too had his place within them. Through his reading, education, time in Paris, and immersion in French culture, Napoleon had been imbued with French ideas even while he was a zealous Corsican patriot. He could see how provincial Corsica's concerns were compared to the universal ideas thrown up by the French Revolution, which was threatened by a full-scale invasion from Austria and Prussia. Over the coming months, Napoleon began to think of himself more and more as French and less as Corsican. When years later, a mayor attempted to compliment him by saying, "It is surprising, sire, that though you are not a Frenchman, you love France so well and have done so much for her." Napoleon recalled, "I felt as if he had struck me a blow. I turned my back on him." Soon after his arrival, Napoleon travelled to Corte, where he was received glacially by Paoli, who scathingly invited him to go back to France. Paoli was clearly growing lukewarm towards the revolution, and Napoleon was led to suspect that his old hero harboured the design of betraying the island to the English. Their last meeting took place at a secluded convent in the interior of the island, where Napoleon supposedly entreated Paoli to abandon the unpatriotic enterprise. Napoleon argued that the violence in France was too terrible to be lasting, and that the nation would soon return to order and law. He then pointed out that Corsica was too small and feeble to think of maintaining independence amidst the great empires of Europe, that in manners, language, custom and religion it could never be a part of England, and that its natural connection lay with France. However, Paoli had formed a strong attachment to England during his exile there, and perhaps he could not forget the days when he had fled before the conquering armies of France. And yet Napoleon still seemed sincerely to believe that he could simultaneously pursue the revolution's policies and yet also maintain his relationship with Paoli, who opposed the Republic, the suppression of the monasteries, and much of the rest of the revolutionary agenda. While in France, despite what had happened, Napoleon had advised Joseph to hold tight to Paoli. He is everything and can do everything. Yet Paoli had blocked Joseph, who he now disliked, from taking a seat in the convention, and refused to take Lucien onto his staff. As Joseph summed it up, Paoli was impressed by Lucien's talents, but he does not want to ally with us. That is the heart of the matter. As for Napoleon, Paoli had by now become merely irritated by his excessive admiration for him, and famously called him a big, inexperienced boy. Napoleon came away from the meeting with his childhood hero with wounded pride. The situation was now clear. The Buonapartes were among the pro-French clan on the island, while Paoli led the separatist clan. Paoli even resorted to trying to put an end to Napoleon's position in the Corsican National Guard, which forced Napoleon to threaten to resort to Parisian political pressure. Despite Paoli's best efforts, Napoleon managed to resume his post, but his role was a new one, because the French Revolution had entered yet another phase. The alienation between the Buonapartes and the Paolis was accelerated by the execution of King Louis XVI. A witness who was present when Napoleon heard of King Louis's death recalled him saying, "Oh, the wretches, the poor wretches, they will go through anarchy." Napoleon thought of the king's execution, followed in October by that of Marie Antoinette, as a national disgrace, but also a tactical error. Had the French been more moderate and not put Louis to death, he later said, all Europe would have been revolutionized. The war saved England. Yet at that time, Napoleon, like most people, publicly supported what had been done, and began to start his letters with the new Republican address of Citizen. In February, France declared war on Britain and Holland, Shortly after Spain, Portugal, and the Kingdom of Piedmont in Italy had declared war on France, the European monarchies were coming together to punish the regicide republic. Although it is likely that war would have broken out between them eventually anyway, the declaration of the war against Britain by the revolutionary regime was a profound mistake. The Tory government of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, who had come to power in 1783 at the astonishingly young age of 24, was viscerally opposed to revolutionary France. Taking advantage of its insular island geography, Britain was to become by far the most persistent of all the opponents of revolutionary and then Napoleonic France, with which it would be at peace for only 14 months of the next 23 years. Seeing the chaos in France, Britain saw the opportunity to use her naval power to sweep French trade from the world's oceans, neutralise or capture French colonies, and cement her position as the world's greatest commercial power, especially after her humiliating loss of America only a decade earlier. For Pitt and his followers, unyielding opposition to the French Revolution and later to Napoleonic France was not only an ideological imperative for the Conservatives, it also made perfect geopolitical sense, as it gave Britain the opportunity of replacing France as the world's leader. To that end, the Pittites in London would fund a series of military coalitions against France, numbering no fewer than 7 in all, by paying other countries massive direct government-to-government cash subsidies, what Napoleon would dub Pitt's gold. Meanwhile, the French had just won a decisive victory at the Battle of Valmy. This battle turned the tide of the war. All the pent-up energy unleashed by the new constitution was now directed against the external enemies of the French people, the kings, noblemen and bishops who had dared to send their armies to invade France. Not only did the French army fight back, but it drove the enemy out and carried the war onto their own soil, seizing Savoy. The French Revolution had taken the offensive. A patriot, and Napoleon wished above all to be a patriot, was no longer a man who brought to his fellows the benefits of the Constitution, but one who fought in the front line against the enemy bent on suppressing those benefits. Salicetti highlighted this point to him. France was at war with King Victor Amadeus of Piedmont, and one of the king's possessions was the nearby island of Sardinia. If Corsica wished to continue to be identified with France, then she must march against the common enemy. Paoli was reluctant to attack Sardinia itself, which would surely retaliate, but he did agree to strike a small-scale blow by attacking the small islands of Madalenna and Caprera just off its coast. Napoleon ensured that he and his battalion were chosen for this patriotic expedition. In February 1793, Napoleon and his senior colleague, Colonel Cuenza, embarked with 800 men of the National Guard and 2 12-pounder cannons. Their ship was manned by desperados from Marseille, who had already won a bad reputation by getting drunk in Ajaccio and killing 3 Corsicans. Head command of this expedition had been entrusted by Paoli to his nephew, Cesare, who Napoleon privately derided as a clothes horse. Napoleon was as eager as only a young officer could be about his first battle, and during the stormy 4-day voyage, it was noticed that he was scrupulous about fulfilling orders to the last detail. Eventually, the expedition arrived on the island of San Stefano, within cannon range of Madalenna. With only 50 men, Napoleon landed on the beach, overcame the Sardinian defences and brought his artillery ashore. They were met with musket fire from a small Sardinian garrison and lost 1 man wounded. Quickly the French occupied the whole island, apart from 1 square tower where the Sardinians had gathered. When this fell, Napoleon then focused his guns on Madalenna to cover the landing that he thought Cesare would make at once with the rest of the men. But Cesare refused to land that night. Napoleon pleaded. Cesare still refused. As Napoleon wrote in his report, "We lost the favourable moment, which in war decides everything." For 2 nights and a day, in high wind and drenching rain, and vulnerable to enemy attack, Napoleon waited patiently. Eventually, he received his orders to open fire. He did so to good effect, bombarding Madalenna with shells and red-hot shot, which set fire to it 4 times, and reducing the guns in the 2 enemy forts to silence. Next day, Cesare at last ordered the main attack, but in the 3 days of inaction, any zeal the Marseille sailors might have had was gone. 1 sailor had been killed by a Sardinian shell, and the others were frightened of the 450 Sardinian troops on Madalenna. "Take us back," they shouted to Cesare, who tried in vain to rally them, But the sailors only became threatening and at last mutinous. Cesare broke down in tears and was promptly nicknamed Le Pleureur, the Crier. The sailors forced Cesare to write a letter to Cuenza, ordering him to evacuate San Stefano. When they read it, Cuenza and Napoleon could hardly believe their eyes, but of course they had to obey. Napoleon and his men, heaving and pushing, managed to get their 1-ton guns through the mud and down to the beach, but their ship had only sent enough boats to evacuate the troops. In this, his first battle, a furious Napoleon had to spike his guns and abandon them to the enemy. He and his men barely escaped from the failed invasion with their lives, and perhaps Napoleon had a sneaking suspicion that he had been set up. As the ill-fated expedition sailed back to Corsica, Napoleon suffered all the pangs of disappointment, frustration and shame that can be expected from a first major failure. It was an inauspicious start for the future conqueror of Europe, but the Madalenna disaster left a lasting impression on Napoleon. It taught him, as only a first failure could, the difficulty of combined operations. It taught him the importance of speed, of the favourable moment when men are tensed for action and the enemy surprised. It taught him the vital importance of firmness in a commander, morale, and of discipline in the ranks, more powerfully than any number of academic lectures. It also left him with the conviction that if he had been in charge instead of Cesare, then they would have succeeded. In the aftermath, Napoleon felt scorn for the cowardly Cesare and deep indignation towards the treacherous Marseille sailors, which he did not try to hide. So much so that a few days after their return to Corsica, the sailors seized Napoleon's silver-fitted dressing case, and with cries of "the aristocrat of the lanterne," they tried to string him up. Luckily for Napoleon, this was prevented by the arrival of some of his National Guardsmen. Napoleon's immediate reaction was to write a letter of complaint to the War Office, urging a new expedition to seize Madalenna and wipe out this stain of dishonour, as he called it. He added that it was only the hope of success that had sustained them. Although Napoleon did not name Paoli in his report, whose reputation in the convention was already at a low ebb, thanks to Salicetti, the Madalenna expedition finished it off. Salicetti and 2 other deputies were sent to Corsica to investigate. Paoli, as chief of state, had final responsibility for what happened, and the outcome, whatever the cause, probably pleased him. Had Paoli provided the 10,000 men that the convention had requested for the expedition, rather than just 1/10 of that number, it might have succeeded. Some have since claimed that Paoli secretly instructed his nephew to deliberately fail the enterprise and lose Napoleon in the process. And indeed, together with an artillery battery, Napoleon almost did get left behind on the beach under enemy attack. With rebels known as Chouans in the deeply Catholic Vendée region of western France, rising in support for the Bourbons against the atheist revolution, with government commissioners crisscrossing France to ensure ideological purity, reportedly bringing a portable guillotine with them, and with Paoli fortifying the Ajaccio citadel, Napoleon's options were narrowing. After his return, events moved quickly. Napoleon tried to straddle his 2 loyalties as long as he could, but the impending break between the Buonapartes and Paoli was further spurred on by Joseph and Lucien, who after one spat, Paoli called a serpent. Joseph, to the stern disapproval of the high-minded Paoli, was thought to be misappropriating and pocketing public funds, probably with Salicetti's compliance. As for Lucien, his relationship with Napoleon was rocky to say the least. He had recently written to Joseph, "I have always distinguished in Napoleon an ambition not entirely altogether egoist, but one which surpasses in him his love for the public good. I really believe that in a free state he would be a dangerous man." But in one short year, Lucien, the arch-revolutionary of the family, went from idolising Paoli to openly slandering him. Unbeknownst to his older brothers, Lucien had decided that Paoli was dragging his feet, and even favouring the English, who were at war with France. So Lucien went to Toulon, and in a flamboyant speech denounced Paoli in a rambling 2-hour discourse, carried on by cheers from the audience. An inspiring public speaker, the words that poured from his mouth were a frontal attack on Paoli, which included calling on the French Revolutionary Tribunal to deliver his head to the sword of justice. Paoli was accused of every treachery, including secret collaboration with England. Lucien's foolhardy speech was printed and circulated throughout France, and was even read in the convention. As a result, the French government ordered that Paoli be dismissed from his post in Corsica, and summoned back to France. When Paoli refused, they declared him an outlaw. Napoleon at first did not know of Lucien's speech, but he was aware of the onslaught on Paoli being mounted in France. The reality made him flinch. It was one thing to duel with Paoli in Corsican politics, but quite another to see his father's friend, and the island's great hero, being accused of political crimes, for which he would be guillotined if the convention ever got hold of him. So Napoleon picked up his pen and dashed off an eloquent defence of Paoli. He tried to demonstrate what nonsense it was for the convention to maintain that the Patriarch of Liberty, the precursor of the French Republic, would at 17 in poor health abandon his life of dedication to democracy and side with the anti-revolutionaries. We Corsicans owe him everything, including the happiness of becoming citizens of the French Republic. All the same, Napoleon's words made no difference. The island rose in revolt for Paoli. Their father, Salicetti, was burnt in effigy, and the trees of liberty that had been planted by the Republicans were hacked down. Only a few towns, containing French military garrisons, held out for the French Republic. Word now hit Corti of Lucien's damning speech at Toulon. "I've given our enemies a knockout blow," bragged Lucien in a letter to his brothers. "You didn't expect that, did you?" Corsican custom required Napoleon, at this point, either to kill or disown Lucien, or to shoulder his words and to leave Corsica. Napoleon did not hesitate to stand by his blood. Still, he wrote a letter to the French Minister of War, whom he trusted, frankly admitting that Lucien's presence in the south of France was dangerous not only for himself, but for the welfare of the public, and he requested for the minister to have Lucien sent back to Corsica. When Salicetti landed in Corsica to arrest Paoli, Napoleon went to see him in a last-ditch attempt to reconcile Paoli with France. But when this failed, Napoleon made the decision to travel to Corte to stand by Paoli in the crisis. But it was all too little too late. Napoleon's and Paoli's best intentions were swallowed up in the jaws of the French Revolution, which had remorselessly set them against one another. Now, finally, after months of conflict, the daggers were openly drawn between Napoleon and Paoli, as between the Revolution and Corsica. Now the Buonaparte children heard their father slandered. Allusions were made to Carlo's swift desertion of Paoli and the Corsican cause all those years ago, and his friendship with the French governor, Marbeuf. Paoli believed that Napoleon, like Lucien, had turned against him and declared him an outlaw, issuing an order for his arrest. "Prepare yourselves," Napoleon told his family. "This country is not for us." Fleeing Ajaccio, Napoleon was forced to go into hiding and took to the Maquis. Meanwhile, Paoli visited Letizia and tried, in a last-ditch effort, to convince her to abandon the French cause. "Resistance is hopeless," he said, "and by this perverse opposition you are bringing irreparable ruin and misery on yourself and family." "I know of but two laws," replied Letizia, "which it is necessary for me to obey, the laws of honour and of duty." Soon after, a decree was passed, banishing the entire Buonaparte family from the island. As Napoleon rode to join Joseph at Bastia, he entered a wild ravine among the mountains. Suddenly, he was surrounded by a band of peasant mountaineers in the employ of Paoli and taken prisoner. They brought him back to Pozzo di Borgo, who decided he would get rid of his old rival by handing him over to the English. The order, which could have thrown Napoleon to prison for a good part of his youth, did not take effect because some loyal villagers near where the Buonapartes had an estate freed him. Napoleon eventually reached Bastia by fishing boat. He was now an outlaw who Paoli's men would shoot on sight. But he was also a French officer committed to the notion that Corsica was part of France. Where a less conscientious man would have saved his own skin and caught the first boat back to France, Napoleon decided not only to hang on, but to fight back. Ajaccio, he explained to Salicetti, was mainly pro-French. With 2 warships and 400 light infantry, Napoleon felt sure that the French could seize the town. He spoke so convincingly that Salicetti agreed to give it a try and gave the orders. By attacking Ajaccio, Napoleon knew that he would be putting his family in danger. He sent a message to his mother, warning her that hundreds of peasants were on the march to attack their house and arrest them. The Buonapartes fled, carrying the few possessions that they could seize at the moment, which was little but the clothes on their back. They secretly made their way to the ruined tower of Capitello near the sea, where Napoleon had told them to wait for him. For several days, Napoleon's mother and 5 little brothers and sisters wandered along the seashore. They had escaped just in time, for the house was attacked by a mob and all the furniture destroyed. Sailing in a small boat at the head of French warships, Napoleon luckily sighted his mother on the shore, signalling urgently. Alarmed for her safety, he jumped into the sea. After a brief warm embrace, he sent her and his siblings by boat to the French-held town of Calvi. Next day, Napoleon blazed away at the Ajaccio citadel with the ship's guns, but the stone walls, several feet thick, resisted. Only 31 men from Ajaccio joined the French siege. Napoleon had miscalculated popular feeling, and since the citadel wall still held, he was forced to give up and sail back. However, one small triumph is recorded. Some Ajaccians had climbed into the trees beside the port and were hurling abuse at the French troops. Napoleon quietly loaded one of his light guns, took careful aim and fired. The shot shattered a branch on which one of the taunters was perched. He dropped like a stone, and the rest, roaring with laughter, dispersed. Not long after, in Calvi, Napoleon managed to rejoin his mother and siblings. Although his family were now safe, to Napoleon's mind, he had failed. He had failed to prevent a split between Paoli and the French. Failed for Ajaccio. Not only he, but his family were outlaws. The Corsican assembly had condemned the Buonapartes to perpetual execration and infamy. The Buonapartes were also financially ruined, for Paolis had sacked and confiscated all their property on Corsica and seized all their corn, oil and wine. A few trunks and bandboxes contained all their available property. As far as Napoleon could see, on Corsica there was nothing further to be done. Napoleon and Joseph would manage to obtain passports for the whole family. Distancing themselves from their aristocratic origins, Letizia was described as a seamstress. A week later, Napoleon would, by a hair's breadth, safely get his family on board an ammunition ship, returning to France. At midnight on the 10th of June 1793, at Calvi, with no money and few possessions apart from the clothes they wore, the Buonapartes, in the dim light of a lantern, stepped aboard an open boat manned by 4 strong rowers. The oarsmen pulled out into the dark open sea, and Napoleon took his place at the bow of the ship. Napoleon's rupture with Paoli was something that he was always ashamed of, and always regretted. Paoli, a month after the Buonapartes were exiled, separated Corsica from France, and turned to the British to reclaim Corsica. Paoli recognised King George III as its king. But Paoli would get along so poorly with the English viceroy that only a few years later, the English government forced him to retire to London, where he lived out the rest of his days. Napoleon would only see the island of his birth once more in his life. The cyclone of the Revolution, and perhaps also his youthful failures there, destroyed any residue of Napoleon's passion for Corsica. An older Napoleon later reflected, "I am not Corsican. I was brought up in France, therefore I am French, as are my brothers. To my way of thinking, Brienne was my patrie. I am more Champenois than Corsican." When the morning sun rose, the family of refugees were approaching the harbour of Toulon, bringing to an end nearly 275 years of Buonaparte residence on the island. The Buonapartes had lost everything, but in less than a decade they would rise to become Imperial Highnesses of France and Europe.